The MCU, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is this giant universe where tons of different characters and arcs and stories come together to create this giant hive mind. Since 2008, Marvel has released over 30 movies and 8 TV shows to bring this together. There's been ups and downs, but overall, the franchise has grown to be beyond anything anyone could have ever imagined since Iron Man, and the franchise is growing larger and larger every year. The universe is divided into different subsections called phases, with larger, broader sections called sagas. Most recently, we finished the Infinity Saga with Thanos as the main antagonist, and this was from phases 1 through 3. The full climax of the Infinity Saga was Endgame, which wrapped up the entire 10+ year project. Technically, the final project in phase 3 wasn't actually Avengers Endgame, it was Spider-Man Far From Home, but Far From Home was kind of an intro to what was coming after, and today, that after is known as phase 4 of the MCU. With that being said, after phase 3 ended, fans didn't know what to expect. We didn't know if we'd get a lot of projects or just a little bit. Besides Spider-Man No Way Home, pretty much every single loose end had been closed. But on the contrary, we actually got phase 4 earlier than ever, not making us wait whatsoever for these projects, and introduced tons of new characters, TV shows, protagonists, antagonists, anti-heroes, and more. Similar to phase 1, phase 4 was kind of a soft reboot of an entire universe where we got introduced to tons of new characters, but the difference was we were getting way more projects than we got in phase 1. Phase 1 had 6 Marvel projects, including Iron Man, Iron Man 2, Thor, Captain America, The Incredible Hulk, and Avengers. Contrary to this, in phase 4, we got Black Widow, Shang-Chi, Eternals, Spider-Man No Way Home, Doctor Strange, Thor Love and Thunder, and Black Panther Wakanda Forever. 7 movies isn't really that much, but when you factor in the other projects the MCU has been releasing at the same time, you realize that this franchise is growing at an insane rate, and it's getting too big for their own hands. We also got 8 TV shows and 2 TV specials, all in the time span of 2 calendar years. Many of these projects were met with mixed reception on whether they were good or not, with many being said to have a great foundation, great characters, and great potential, but falling flat in the 3rd act and the climax of the projects. For example, WandaVision was extremely loved by the entire fan base for the first 6 or 7 episodes, but fell flat when a generic villain was introduced to the show, and the final episode became a CGI fest. After WandaVision, Marvel began to follow this pattern of TV show releases where each show would start off incredibly strong but fall flat because they were pushed into a 6-episode time frame. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Loki, Hawkeye, and Moon Knight all had 6 episodes each, and this in itself was a problem. Each show followed a similar pattern in the timeline where it was structured. For example, the introduction to each show would be absolutely amazing, introducing us to the main and side characters pretty much almost perfectly. Afterwards, we would get into the main story of the show, and eventually we would reach this new turning point in the plot where everything would change. This generally happened around the 4th episode of the show. After the 4th episode is where the problems really began. In almost every single one of these shows, a new antagonist was introduced at the very end, not giving the antagonist enough screen time to be anything more than a one-dimensional character that comes off as poorly written. The endings felt rushed for every single project, and you could almost tell that Marvel was trying to fit in as much information as they could into 2 episodes, making them not only poorly written, but leaving a ton of loose ends open for the future. Now, Marvel's way of validating these open-ended questions are exciting us for the future with Phase 5, 6, and the future of the MCU. The issue with this is these projects aren't necessarily self-contained, and they don't work as their own TV shows as they require you to keep watching the universe. 2 prime examples of this are Kingpin from Hawkeye and Kang from Loki. Now, Kingpin and Kang are understandably great characters in the MCU, and in my opinion, Loki and Hawkeye are 2 of the better projects that have been released in Phase 4. But regardless of that, the last episode of Loki and the last 2 episodes of Hawkeye are 2 of the consecutively lowest points in the shows. Even Moon Knight, which is majorly liked by tons of audiences all across the world, comes off as rushed in the final episode because you know exactly what's going to happen. The 6-episode format becomes so generic that you can already predict the finale without it even occurring. The final MCU TV show in Phase 4 was She-Hulk, and it did separate itself from the generically structured 6-episode format, but regardless, failed to please the majority of the fans. Many people call She-Hulk a CGI fest, falling flat in many different areas, including the writing, the character development, the plot devices, and the antagonists. Additionally, the final episode of the show tries to be self-aware and doesn't do an amazing job. To further this point, Kevin Feige himself has addressed these issues and is aware that the 6-episode format is not viable. I believe that's the reason he made Daredevil Born Again 18 episodes. The MCU considers Phase 4 an experimental phase which introduces us to TV shows like we've never seen before. The issue here is that the franchise is far too large for trial and error. It doesn't work because the expectations are too high, and that brings us to the next issue. Many of the Phase 1 movies in the MCU really weren't that great. For example, The Incredible Hulk and Thor weren't super widely appreciated, but for their time, the bar for MCU projects was far lower. After movies like Avengers Infinity War, Captain America Civil War, and Avengers Endgame, the bar for movies is much higher, and many of the movies in Phase 4 fail to reach that bar or even come close. Black Widow, Eternals, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and Thor Love and Thunder all failed to even come close to the bar that the MCU now has. While there were many good TV shows and movies in Phase 4, for example, Shang-Chi, Spider-Man No Way Home, and Black Panther, the better parts of Phase 4 don't come off as strongly because the lower parts of Phase 4 seem to be dragging it down. Movies like Shang-Chi are amazing because they're self-contained intros to new characters that are extremely well done, but these projects shouldn't be outliers. The biggest issue with getting new MCU characters in projects that aren't necessarily amazing is that the characters won't be as likable. The entire point of Phase 4 is to reboot the universe and give us a ton of new characters to set up different groups, including the Thunderbolts and the Young Avengers. Not only that, but they also set up different timelines like the Galaxy timeline, the Earth timeline, and the Multiverse timeline. This doesn't work if the fans can't understand and love the characters the way they did in Phase 1. That attachment needs to be there, and it won't be there if the projects that they're introduced in just aren't up to par. Not only that, but the sheer amount of different timelines to be caught up with going into this phase is extremely confusing and disconnected. It almost feels like homework having to watch every other project because you have to know what's going on because eventually it'll all come together. There's literally no way to understand how this can happen, and that creates a lot of questions. Now, don't get me wrong, I've said nothing but bad about Phase 4, but there were a lot of good parts of it. Something Phase 4 does very well is portraying the consequences of people's actions and the grief they have to deal with. The issue is that it was very hit or miss for many of the audience, and Phase 5 will solidify whether Phase 6 is successful or not. The expectations for Marvel are higher than ever now, with Kang Dynasty coming out and Secret Wars coming out a year later. Kang is an amazing antagonist in the comics, and if Marvel fails to deliver on that portrayal, it'll be the biggest fumble of comic book history. If you didn't know this, Marvel currently has 31 projects in development right now. That number of projects is insane for any studio when so many projects recently have not been that good. It's terrifying to think about how so many good characters could be done so dirty if they're just poorly written, and I don't want to see that happen. I know a lot of the audience is terrified for Daredevil Born Again because Daredevil is amazing as its own show, and Marvel has a way of ruining certain amazing characters, for example Taskmaster and the Incredible Hulk. With Phase 4 coming to its conclusion this month, we will be entering the second act of the Multiverse Saga in Phase 5. There are an absolute ton of projects coming out in Marvel Phase 5, including Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, Secret Invasion, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, Echo, The Marvels, Loki Season 2, potentially Blade, Ironheart, Agatha Coven of Chaos, Captain America New World Order, Daredevil Born Again, and Thunderbolts. Phase 4 was the foundation of introducing new characters into the Multiverse Saga to fight Kang, and Phase 5 will be the foundation of Kang himself. While Phase 4 is questionable, if Marvel delivers on Phase 5, the Multiverse Saga will still be amazing. But on the contrary, even though Phase 4 is questionable, if they fail to deliver on Phase 5, the Multiverse Saga will fail. Often, many filmmakers say that the most acceptable part of a movie being poor is the first act. While the first act of a movie is the foundation and the base, the second act brings it together, and the third act gives it a good climax. The foundational structure of most movies parallels sagas in the MCU. The entire saga will be determined by Phase 5 because it's not an intro, but it's also not the climax. It's the part that brings the entire phase together, and it will be the heart of the saga. It won't be the most intense, but it also won't have the freedom that Phase 4 had. The characters have been introduced to us. Now it is time for Phase 5 to deliver on making us like the characters and giving them all good stories. If Marvel Marvel Phase 5 succeeds, we will enter Phase 6 with a lot of excitement for the future of the MCU, and there will be a lot of hype around Avengers Secret Wars and Kang Dynasty. Unfortunately, if Marvel Phase 5 fails to deliver, or even does a job similar to that of Phase 4, I'm afraid that Phase 6 will not be as appreciated, and Marvel will have failed to deliver on the multiverse saga. Overall, the stakes are higher than ever. With Phases 1 through 3, we had never seen anything like this. There was no giant universe that was as well done as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. The way Thanos was introduced to us in every post-credit scene and built up over time through the use of the Infinity Stones was absolutely incredible. Now that we've seen this happen before, we know exactly what to expect going into Phase 4, 5, and 6. While the content from the first 3 phases is different, the structure is exactly the same, and now the fans know what to expect. Marvel did a lot of things wrong in Phase 4, but they also did a lot of things right. Phase 5 is Marvel's chance to not just succeed, but thrive in this new environment that they're developing. All they have to do is deliver. If they do this right, Phase 6 will be bigger than Phase 3 ever was, and it'll be one of the greatest cinematic experiences of all time. With that being said, the pressure will continue to rise as Phase 5 will become the make or break of the MCU.